Really lucky today to be joined by Alexandra Posadzki from the Globe and Mail. Alex, thank you very much for joining us today on CSI Chat. Just to give people a little bit of background on Alex, she is a graduate of the Toronto Metropolitan University Master of Journalism program. She spends most of her time now as a business reporter with the preeminent or one of the preeminent Canadian newspapers, being the Globe and Mail. Focusing on the telecommunications industry. She's also a bit of a movie star. She's featured in the Netflix documentary Trust No One: The Hunt for the Crypto King. And what we're here to talk about today, obviously, is the very successful book that she has written called Rogers v. Rogers. Now, Alex, if you give me a second here, I just need to make a bit of a public service announcement to all of our listeners, because you got a lot of people who are interested in business, and I just need to have 1 second or a few seconds here to talk to the listeners, because for the people who are listening, you will really enjoy this book. And what I'm going to tell you to do is to follow a couple of quick steps before we get into this interview, because you're going to thank me in about 60 minutes. You're going to open up your browser, whether that's Chrome or Internet Explorer, whatever it is. You're going to go on Amazon.ca. You're going to go into the search bar, and you're gonna type in Rogers v. Rogers. There's a book that's going to pop up that's written by Alexandra Posadzki, and you're going to click buy. Now, whether you buy the electronic version or the hard copy version, it does not matter. But you're going to want to buy it. Now, why do you want to actually buy this book? Well, again, first of all, I've read the book. The book people will find it very interesting. The characters in the book, again, this is a true story. This is a very prominent Canadian company. People are going to find it really interesting. So, but that's just the story of Rogers. The other reason people, I think, are going to find this book really interesting is because the issue of succession does not just impact a company like Rogers. It probably impacts, 80-90% of the companies that are out there. I've had board members tell me that the most important aspect of their role is to deal with succession. And frankly, it's not just a board role. It's a responsibility that trickles right down into the organization, including, if you've had the same boss for 20 years and you think to yourself, well, what happens if that boss leaves? Again, the issue of succession really impacts all of us. And what I've found around here is that when you have two people who have actually read Alex's book, you can actually engage in a pretty fun discussion talking about the pros and cons of what went wrong and what went well at Rogers, as well as how it affects your own life. So hopefully you already bought the book now. And again, in 60 minutes, you're going to thank me, because if you bought it electronically, you'll have it ready to read. And if you bought the one that's going to ship, it'll ship hopefully a little bit quicker than having to wait an extra 60 minutes in order to do this. So, Alex, again, thank you very much for joining. The way I want to start the chat is by trying to figure out what the common theme is of the book, because this particular book, there's a lot of different themes in the book. Love, death, family, power, perseverance, bravery. There's a lot of different themes, which is one of the reasons why the book is so good, is that there's so many aspects to the book. If you were to break it down into one common theme, what would you pick as the common theme in the book?
I think the overarching theme really would have to be family, because we are talking about a family dynasty here. And, when I was writing this book, a lot of people asked me what kind of a book I was writing. They would ask, is it a business book or is it a book about the Rogers family? And I would essentially tell them that it's both, because you really cannot separate the family from the company here. And anyone who has a family business or who's worked in a family business will have seen the many ways in which the family dynamics affect essentially the business. And we have a lot of family-controlled companies in Canada, very, very prominent companies that employ this sort of dual-class share structure that Rogers employs, where you have, ultimately a class of voting shares and a class of non-voting shares. And the voting shares are predominantly held within, in this case, trusts that are controlled by the Rogers family. And so when you have a family controlled company like this, the two are very closely interwoven. And so I would say that family is sort of the one theme that carries us through the whole book. And power is a pretty important theme as well, because this is, of course, an extraordinarily powerful family that has, an influence on millions of people's lives through the wireless business that they operate, the cable business that they operate, the media companies that they own, the sports teams that they own, the Rogers Center, of course. So this is an extraordinarily influential and powerful family. And when you look at what went down within Rogers, particularly in the fall of 2021, which is very much kind of the climax or the focus of the book, if you will, you can really see that it was all about power and exercising power and control over this massive behemoth of a company.
When did you think that there was a book involved? Because obviously you spend the vast majority of your working time following the telecom industry, and I'm sure there's lots of fun stories and unique stories that you come across every single day. And I'm just wondering, at what point did you kind of get to a conclusion? You say, you know what, for this particular one, it's actually going to be make for a really unique book and a really unique story that I think a lot of people out there would really like to understand the details.
That's a great question. To be completely honest, I was actually approached by a literary agent who asked me whether I wanted to write a book. And this happened shortly after I had broken the story about, which I'm sure we'll get into, the disputed butt dial. And I think that was the moment, because it was just such an out of the ordinary thing to have, this allegation that the CEO of a major telecom company, a major wireless company, allegedly learns of a plot to unseat him via an inadvertent phone call between himself and his CFO, who's poised to take over the role once he's ousted. And it was just one of those stranger than fiction kind of moments.
Absolutely.
And that was sort of the moment when I realized that there was probably a book here.
So the other thing that, in terms of timing, obviously the issue of Succession has gotten a lot more prominence because of the TV series that's based in the U.S. Of the same name, Succession, that focuses also on a media company. And when I watch a lot of your, you've been on TV a bunch talking about your book, or you're on a podcast, there's an immediate comparison to the TV show Succession. And rightfully so. At the heart of it, the book focuses on succession, and obviously the TV show is named Succession, but again, at the heart of the TV show is succession. But I actually don't think that's a fair comparison, because I actually think the book and the characters in the book are far more interesting, and there's far more details there than the TV series. So am I saying that the book is actually better than the TV series? Yes, that's what I'm saying, is that the book is actually better than the TV series. Now, why would you say that, Scott? Well, if you look at the characters in the book, because I've read the book, watched the TV series, all 4 seasons. The characters in the book, I think, are a lot smarter than the people in Succession. I think the relationships are, first of all, it's real relationships. This is not a fictional story in the book. This is a real story with very complicated relationships. I think in a lot of cases, a lot of the characters in the book are actually quite likable. I think a lot of them, they're talked about in ways where they rally the staff, and people are loyal to certain factions and things like that. And the other thing too is, again, Succession is so, every second word is, an F-bomb, and there's so much personal attacks and things like that. And that's not the book. The book is, especially in the earlier days, this was a very loving family within Rogers. So if we do a quick rundown of the characters for those that have seen the TV series, Ted Rogers, in my 2 cents, is absolutely nothing like Logan Roy. There's, Ted, I think, is a lot more interesting than Logan Roy is. There is one of the most impressive people in the entire book, Alex, that I thought was Loretta. to me, there is nobody in Succession that's anywhere close to Loretta. Like the way that the women are featured in Succession, the wives is nothing like Loretta. Loretta is. I love the way that you describe Loretta in the book, and we're going to talk about her in a second. Edward is nothing like Kendall. I don't think those two are anywhere in the near stratosphere. There is no Roman and there is no Greg at all in the book, which is a great thing. I don't, maybe that there's a Tom at some point in the book. Maybe there's somebody close to a Shiv in the book. I don't know. But I'm now gonna read the second best quote in the book, Alex. This is the second best quote. And if there's one person from your book that I would love to have a drink with, it's Martha Rogers. And when all this was going down, obviously the newspapers were comparing this to Succession. And the quote in your book is, this is a direct tweet from Martha at the time, was, "Succession, please. It feels more like Game of Thrones, and I hope to God I'm Arya." Like, what a great quote. But maybe to kind of set the table here, I'd love it if you kind of gave some perspective on some of the key players in the book, because in addition to going through the events of Rogers, it's the book is also really good on educating people on Rogers itself, one of the largest Canadian companies, one of the most successful Canadian companies that are out there. And maybe if you just give us some perspective on some of the key players, and we're kind of set the table here. So obviously the starting person of all this is Ted Rogers, and Ted would be one of the most successful Canadian entrepreneurs in history. Maybe just give us some perspective on Ted as the founder and kind of one of the key players within Rogers.
Absolutely. Although now that you've said that that's your second favorite quote, I'm dying to know what your favorite quote is.
And I'll tell you, like I love relaying quotes around here, and I will get to my favorite quote is actually from Ted, and we'll get to that in a second. And I have dropped that quote now probably at least like 15 or 20 times around the office, and we all love the quote. So we'll get to the quote because it is awesome. It is so perfect. But anyway, give us your perspective on Ted, because you do a great job in the book of giving history of Rogers and some history of Ted as well.
Sure. So Ted is a really fascinating guy. And of course, there is no Rogers book without Ted Rogers. Ted grows up, even though he's very much part of the Canadian establishment, he always sort of feels like an outsider to the Canadian establishment. And he's got this interesting history because his father, who's the inventor of the first batteryless radio, which is where the name CFRB comes from, Canada's first batteryless radio, Ted's father dies when Ted is a boy, and his father is still quite young. And his mother slips into alcoholism, and so she, unable to take care of Ted herself, ultimately sends him off to boarding school. And so he grows up in boarding school at Upper Canada College, of course, and he's this kid. He's kind of picked on a lot because he's very gangly, he's thin, he's got all these health problems. The kids start calling him Bones. And what's sort of interesting is he takes that around and he ends up becoming a boxer. And even though he's kind of frail, like this is a perfect embodiment of Ted, right? He ends up, I think, winning a boxing contest or tournament or championship or what have you at a school because he's just so determined. And his mother instills in him this dogged determination to restore the Rogers family name back into prominence. And so this is a boy who, in his bed at boarding school, he's thinking about how is he going to achieve this? How is he going to restore the Rogers family name? And he does this, as soon as he graduates, he ends up going to law school. Law doesn't really speak to him, but he starts building a business. He gets a television license. He gets radio stations, and then ultimately starts laying cable, believing cable television to be the next big thing. And he does this, of course, alongside his wife, Loretta Ann Rogers, who started out Loretta Ann Robinson. She's the daughter of a British MP and the heiress of the Woolworth department store dynasty. And as you've mentioned, Loretta is a very impressive woman. She's an interesting character because even though she's she's described as being quite quiet, soft-spoken, maybe even shy, I was also told that she had a very strong intellect, and she had this incredibly subtle way of influencing Ted when he needed a push in the right direction. And they end up mortgaging their home multiple times to build a business, something that she promised her family that they would never do. And so she's this rock, right, who stands by Ted even when it looks like things are going to go south, which happens multiple times throughout the sort of building of Rogers. And ultimately, Ted, of course, succeeds, and he creates this investment grade blue chip telecom company that we know as Rogers Communications today.
And one of the things that really struck me just as a business person is Ted's appetite to risk.
Mm-hmm.
Rogers was built through the use of leverage and the use of risk. Like Ted certainly did not fear putting all of his chips on the table and taking on significant risk in order to grow the business. Would that be fair?
Absolutely. There's actually a book about the founding of Rogers called High Wire Act, Ted Rogers and the Empire That Debt Built by Caroline Van Hassel. And so I think that title really says it all, right? It was a high wire act. And there were times when people called him a gambler and, investors were, saying disparaging things about him and the media was saying disparaging things about him. And so he definitely bet the farm multiple times.
The other thing I really liked from the book is Ted and Loretta as parents, because obviously they had 4 kids. The kids obviously grew up with being around a lot of money. They certainly had a good upbringing that way. But it would seem like Ted and Loretta were both focused on trying to raise their kids the right way as well. In terms of instilling hard work and and they seem to be a very close-knit family growing up. They talk about, the summers at Muskoka. Obviously, Ted was a workaholic. He worked all the time, but maybe just talk a little bit about family life as well, because that is, to me, again, you compare it to the TV series Succession, it's a fundamental difference where it just seems like in this, they grew up with a great family life, especially the kids. And you look at Ted and Loretta, they would seem to be like a good mom and dad to their 4 kids growing up. Would that be fair?
I mean, I think it's all in your own perspective on how you look at it. They certainly grew up in a very different household than I grew up in, for instance, not having money, not having a butler, not having a father who, did make it home for dinner every night, but then quickly disappeared into the office with his papers and his binders. So Ted, as you mentioned, he was a workaholic, and he speaks openly in his own autobiography about how he actually regrets not having spent more time with the children, particularly when they were young, because you don't get those years back. Loretta, I mean, she has been described to me as not always the most hands-on mother when it came time to specific things like planning activities for the children, but it's also very clear that she loved her kids very, very deeply. And I guess just on, this point about succession that you keep bringing up, I think it's a really interesting comparison. Obviously, people have described the story as Canada's real life Succession. And I think I address this in the book. I think that's for a variety of reasons. Chief among them, the fact that season 3 of Succession was actually playing out on television at the same time as Rogers was in the news, headlines every day. And I do think that there are some good reasons for the comparison. You see a lot of similar themes. You see sibling rivalry, you see betrayal and backstabbing in the boardroom, you see corporate intrigue, there's even a disputed butt dial. So there's all these elements. But the one thing that I think you've done a great job of pointing out is that the Roys are a fictional family. That's what Jesse Armstrong, Succession's creator, has said. Even though people will draw whatever comparison to whatever real life family they see, the Rogers family is a real family. And I think that makes the story much more sensitive, and it also makes it much more salient. I think there's something about nonfiction that touches people in kind of a different way. Now, that being said, huge fan of the show Succession, absolutely loved it. I thought it was brilliant, but I do think that is sort of a key difference, is that it's really easy for viewers to kind of hate on a fictional family where none of the characters are sympathetic. And in the Rogers story, we are dealing with real human beings with real emotion.
Absolutely. I agree. So then we get to the kids. And I'm going to break the kids up into two separate groups. Is the kids that worked in the business, and then the kids that didn't work in the business, because there's four kids, and maybe just talk a little bit about first about the kids that weren't involved in the business and their background, and Lisa and Martha, and what are just some interesting tidbits about Lisa and Martha, because as we talked about with Martha, she was on Twitter, and she just seems absolutely hilarious in some of these quotes that she's putting out there. But maybe just give us a little bit of background on the kids, because there is a very big difference between the two. Is you got the kids in the business and the kids that weren't in the business. But maybe start with Lisa and Martha first and give some perspective on them.
Sure. So just to kind of clarify a little bit, all of the kids did at some point work in the family
Okay.
business, even if it was not the path that they ultimately wound up pursuing. They did all have some sort of, whether it be summer jobs or a brief stint or sitting on the boards. So, for instance, Lisa, of course, she's the eldest of the Rogers children. And she ultimately decided not to continue her career at Rogers. And in fact, she moved all the way across the country to Victoria. She was a triathlete. She was very involved in sort of charitable causes and that sort of thing. But she did early on in her life, she did actually work in the family company. And so she was kind of, for Edward, sort of the trailblazer. So Edward, of course, is the first and only son of Ted and Loretta, and he was sort of seen for a long time as the heir apparent, that he was going to inherit the throne of the CEO job. And so, as Ted is building the company, we see Edward kind of working his way up through the business. And then he's followed by Melinda, who also moves into progressively more and more senior roles within the company. And then there's Martha. And Martha's the youngest, and she ends up pursuing a career as a naturopath. But that being said, she does still end up with a seat on the board, on the various boards of Rogers, and ultimately on the board of Rogers Communications once the company has become this sort of conglomerate. And she's also the one who, as you've already alluded to, ends up on Twitter tweeting disparaging things about her older brother and what she describes as his old boys Trump cabal. And so these tweets are fascinating to read. Lots of news that came out of that. And she essentially says that the reason that her dad put her on the board is to sort of serve as a check and balance, because of course she doesn't go on to have a series of increasingly senior VP roles and in the business as two of her older siblings, Edward and Melinda, do.
So then to talk a little bit about Edward and Melinda, and one of the really, one of the things that was interesting from the book as well is about how, I think Ted probably always envisioned Edward working for Rogers at some point in the future, but Edward didn't start off working at Rogers. Ted has actually got him working somewhere. I don't know if he got the job on his own, or however it played out. But maybe just talk a little bit about Edward's upbringing and how it played out. Because again, if you compare that to the real life Succession, or the TV series Succession, that was a lot of the kids there, they were just working their way up within one organization. But what I appreciated, and you provided some details, on how Ted tried to raise his kids, and how Edward didn't. It wasn't just a straight line working up within Rogers. It was a couple of different spots. So maybe, or at least one significant different spot. So maybe just talk a little bit about Edward first, and how he rose up through the ranks through Rogers.
For sure. So Ted ultimately helps Edward secure a job at Comcast. So he actually sends him away to the U.S. to work at Comcast. Ted is friends with the owners of Comcast. And this proves to be a great opportunity for Edward, because within Rogers, everybody knows him as Ted's son, right? And so there's a heightened level of scrutiny that comes from everyone knowing that you're the founder's son. And on top of that, there's a heightened level of scrutiny from Ted himself, right? Who is known as being this very exacting, demanding manager, and, notorious for these fits of rage, flying off on these temper tantrums, and he's not necessarily any different towards his own children. He kind of treats them the same as he treats other employees when they're working for him. And so for Edward to go off to Comcast, this kind of gives him a more neutral ground. The Rogers family is so prominent in Canada and is so well known within Sigma Chi, the fraternity that he was part of, that Edward was part of at Western. And so getting to go to the States, it's sort of a place where the Rogers name is not so well known. And so this allows him to work in a similar way as other people in the telecom business. And when he comes back, he does end up working at Rogers, and he ultimately ascends to the role of head of cable. So he runs the cable division. And at the same time, there's a man named Nadir Mohammed who's running the wireless division. And this is during a period of time where there's perceived to be this kind of tension between cable and wireless. Cable is sort of seen as not as sexy, it's stable, it's got, reliable returns, but wireless is just on this huge upswing. It's the hot new thing, and,
Yep.
the revenues are just soaring. And so the two units are seen as conflict. And to some extent, people see Edward and Nadir as being in conflict for the top job. And what ends up happening, I guess a bit of a spoiler here, is Ted ends up ultimately bypassing Edward and giving the COO job to Nadir, which puts him next in line for CEO. And when Ted passes away, he ultimately leaves it up to the board to decide who should be the CEO of Rogers. Of course, there's all this talk swirling at the time around succession and what's going to happen when Ted steps down or passes away, because in these companies where you have this sort of larger than life founder who's got his hands in everything, there's sayings around Rogers. There's no decision at Rogers too small for Ted to make, right? He's this control freak. And so when you have someone like that who's so integral to the company's success, succession is a really big issue. And Ted ultimately keeps telling the investment community that he feels it should be professional management who leads the company after he's gone. Edward does make a play for the job, but it ends up going to Nadir. However, Edward does secure another, arguably even more important form of succession, and that is he becomes the chair of the Rogers Control Trust, which of course is the trust that has the ability to exercise power over the family's voting stake in Rogers Communications. And it's said within the company that decision actually created some tensions between Edward and his sister Melinda. And that's kind of what precedes what we see going forward, which is a series of CEO changes, ultimately culminating in the conflict that occurs in the fall of 2021 over whether or not Joe Natale, the company's then CEO, should continue to be the CEO of Rogers as Rogers works to integrate its massive, historic $20 billion takeover of Shaw Communications.
So, you had mentioned Melinda a bunch of times in there, because I find her a really interesting character in all this as well, is that she seemed to go off and kind of chart her own path within Rogers, and at some point it would seem like it was a race between Edward and Melinda for that, for who was going to kind of rise up into the organization. But maybe just give some perspective on Melinda and the role that she, because she kind of went off down into the West Coast and did some really kind of unique things with technology and things like that, and some of the ventures that she was involved in. She certainly just wasn't, didn't have some, normal 9-to-5 job within Rogers. It was a pretty unique type of role that she had. Maybe just talk a little bit about Melinda and where she kind of fit in the succession planning as well, if anywhere.
For sure. So Melinda is for sure a very interesting character. She gets an MBA from Rotman. She's the child who Ted describes as being the most like him, to the point that around the office, people actually start referring to Melinda as Ted in a skirt, which, is a bit odd. But, I asked her about this when I had the opportunity to interview her, and she said that she viewed it as a compliment because, of course, her father was such an impressive man. And she is, very strategically minded. So So Ted says, essentially he's concerned that Edward is too financially minded, that he's too financially conservative, and that Melinda is like him, strategically oriented. So she's maybe got a bit more appetite for those types of big strategic moves. And so she ultimately goes off to Silicon Valley and runs what becomes known as Rogers Venture Partners, which is a venture capital fund investing in early stage companies. And when people have asked her about whether or not she wanted to be the CEO of Rogers, because there was, of course, this sort of internal perspective that they were in, her and Edward were in competition for the role, she says no, she never wanted to be the CEO. She prefers working with smaller companies, with startups. But perhaps she would have liked to have more of a say in that family trust structure at the Rogers Control Trust.
So we've gone through all of the Rogers family members, or at least the key family members. I'm just keen to know, as you're writing the book, or even after the book has been published, have you had a chance to sit down and were you able to get information from them that helped with the book? And did they give you any feedback after the book was released in terms of, did they like it or not?
So unfortunately, I was not able to get on the record participation from members of the Rogers family. And this is because I was writing the book, first of all, while the Shaw deal was still in play, still hadn't secured all of the regulatory approvals. And the family at that time had decided that talking to the media was too risky for the deal because of, the very public dispute that we saw and concerns that had sort of destabilized the deal. And so they all agreed to a sort of standstill agreement that precluded them from disparaging one another in the press. And so I unfortunately was not able to get them to agree to interviews. I did, however, manage to speak to over 120 people for this book. The vast majority of them did speak on the condition that their identities remained confidential. But some of them, I spent many, many, many hours with. And I have not gotten any feedback from Edward on what he thinks of the book. So.
What about other senior execs that may have been, like obviously there was a few that left. Have you gotten any feedback from any of the kind of the key players in your book in terms of, what, you got this right and they were happy, or anything along those lines?
I can tell you that a number of the sources that contributed to the reporting have been in touch. Some of them have been quite pleased with, saying things like the book is fair. Maybe they would have preferred if I took their perspective or their side a little bit more, but they respect the fact that it's an unbiased work of journalism. And so I've been told that it's fair, it's factual. Others have been silent, which I take as a good sign that I've done my job correctly.
Yeah. No, it's great. I think it's like you say, it's very factual. Whether a particular CEO did a good job or a bad job and deserved to, move out or however you want to, it's a judgment call, but the book, again, like that's a great way to put it. It's very factual and you can make your own decisions. If you want to learn more, go and read go and do your own research, take your book, read your book, and then go and do more. Now let's get to the independents, is the board of directors. If there was a group that I actually did feel a little bit sympathetic for in the book, the board would certainly be one of them, because if there was ever a time when you're in between a rock and a hard place, I think for some of those board members, I think they were certainly between a rock and a hard place during the events which unfolded. Maybe just give us your perspective, Alex, on the board and what the role is at the board, because the role of the board at Rogers, the role that they play is very unique in that you have this dual class structure of shares. And again, it kind of puts the board in this tricky situation of trying to stand up for the minority shareholders, when even though the minority shareholders might actually be a majority in terms of economically, from a voting perspective, they're actually not. They don't control the decision. So maybe give us some perspective on the board and the tough job that, frankly, it is being a board member at Rogers.
Sure. So the thing about the independent directors of Rogers is they actually were not all in agreement about what the fundamental role of the independent directors on the Rogers board should be. I spoke to a number of corporate governance experts, and everybody is in agreement that the board's single most important duty is hiring and firing the CEO. And the reason why we ended up seeing this rift in the boardroom is because a number of the independent directors felt that they had been stripped of that duty. They felt that Edward had essentially gone and single-handedly decided to fire Joe Natale. Now, just to kind of set the scene a little bit. So Joe has been, the CEO since before the pandemic. So he's been there, let's say, around 4.5-ish years. And he's just signed this $20 billion deal to acquire Shaw, which is the deal of Ted Rogers' dreams, right? Like one of the kind of through lines through the book is this deal because we see very early on Ted Rogers and Shaw founder J.R. Shaw sitting down and through a series of handshake deals, effectively carving the country into East and West, with Rogers, of course, dominating in the East and Shaw dominating in the West. And so this deal is like the coming together of two of Canada's historic cable families, and it creates a truly national player like Ted had always envisioned. And so Joe understandably thinks that things are going pretty well, right? He steered the company through this pandemic, this chaotic pandemic, and he secured this deal to acquire Shaw. And the company is still waiting on regulatory approvals from not one, but three different government bodies or federal bodies. And at the same time, Edward is actually becoming increasingly dissatisfied with Joe Natale's performance. He's specifically focused on a number of key financial metrics where he feels that Rogers is lagging its competitors, Bell and Telus. And this view is shared by a couple of other board members. He ultimately has the backing of two of his father's longtime closest friends, Phil Lind and Alan Horn, as well as Rob Gemmell, who is now the company's lead independent director. And what ends up happening is that, after Edward tells Joe that he's lost confidence in him as a result of this sort of ultimatum that Joe forces upon him when he learns of this plot to have him removed by Tony Staffieri and to have 9 of 11 senior leaders follow him out the door, the leadership team that he had assembled takes this to Edward. Edward tells him, don't blame Tony. It wasn't his idea. It was my idea. I'm not going to agree to fire Tony like you want me to, but I'm willing to work with you on an exit package. And so this is ultimately what goes to the board, right, is this exit package for Joe. And the board ends up ultimately divided, partially in the wake of a very impassioned speech by none other than former Ontario Premier David Peterson, who is playing sort of the role of elder statesman on the Rogers board, who ends up, calling this process disgraceful. And a number of independent directors I'd say the majority of the independent directors are concerned about the impact on the deal if you replace not just the CEO, but all these other senior C-suite leaders while still waiting for approval. Meanwhile, Edward feels that this decision has to be made quickly because he doesn't think that Joe is up to the task of securing the approval and integrating the companies and, surfacing all those synergies that are so essential to the deal's ultimate success. And what's interesting is that the contingent of independent directors who winds up essentially standing up and saying, no, we're going to rescind this whole plan and we're going to keep Joe and we're going to fire Tony and we're going to put some guardrails around Edward to curb what they allege is his frequent interference with management, is that they feel that they are acting for all stakeholders, particularly the Class B non-voting shareholders, in trying to protect the company. And they see this as being sort of their role as the independent directors. And then on the other hand, we have someone like Rob Gemmell, who has told me on the record in the book that he feels that the role of the independent directors is not to be independent from Edward Rogers, the chairman of the Rogers Control Trust and the chairman of the board, but actually to be independent from the company's management. And so the sort of suggestion there seems to be that the independent directors who had decided to try to keep Joe, they had become maybe too close with Joe and his management team, and they were not independent enough there. I'm sure they would say otherwise. They would say that they were simply doing what they felt was in the company's best interest at the time. But the sort of outcome of all of this is, after the board ends up firing to remove Edward as the chairman of the board, he goes and decides to reconstitute the board through this very unusual mechanism, a written shareholder resolution, which actually he's able to do because the laws in British Columbia, where Rogers is actually incorporated, a little known fact, allow him to do so. And the company comes back and says, we don't think that this is legal, what you've done. This has never been done before. We don't think it's legally valid. And so for a period of time, we actually have this very, very unique situation of Rogers effectively having dueling boards, because the company says the board remains constituted exactly the same as it was before, whereas Edward's side is saying, no, we've actually fired these 5 independent directors. We've replaced them with 5 other independent directors. This is now the board of Rogers Communications, and you have that board holding meetings and the other board saying that board isn't valid. And it's just so bizarre. As a business reporter, it's something I've never seen. It's certainly something my editors have never seen. I don't know that something like this has actually happened before in Canada, or really anywhere that I've been able to find. Even the lawyers and the judge involved in the case, ultimately, this lands in court. And so we have a legal case to determine this. They say that this is very anomalous. And one source I spoke to actually described it as Schrodinger's board.
So you've now become an expert on super voting shares and how that can play out. I'm wondering your perspective. Do you think that this super voting structure is a good thing? It clearly has its pros and cons that are attached to it. After everything you've learned and you've gone through and you've researched on this situation, would you be in favor of more of these structures, or based on everything you're learning, saying, no, you know what, this super voting structure should not, really is not that great after all? What's your perspective after learning all of that?
I think it, like you say, there's pros and cons of both, right? And so if you look at dual class share structures, there's certainly an argument to be made for how they allow a founder like Ted Rogers, for example, to take a longer term view. So not so influenced by the quarter to quarter fixation of the market, particularly if you look at how Ted built the company and how much risk was priced into the share price and how much people doubted some of the riskier moves that he made that ended up becoming so integral to the company's success. Like, for example, his decision to get into wireless, which he initially had to do with his own money because every director, including his wife, Loretta, voted against the move. They felt that they didn't have enough money and they needed to focus on their core business, which was cable. And now you look at that move, and where would Rogers have been today without that? And so, as various people, including Melinda, has said this in the past, have pointed out, there's this huge advantage to being able to take a longer term view. Now, Melinda also points out that she feels that, or she felt at that time, that Rogers was not taking a longer term view because there was this high level of turnover in the executive ranks. You had a series of CEOs, right? We had Nadir Mohammed, followed by Guy Lawrence, followed by Joe Natale. Now we have Tony Staffieri. And in between there, we had 2 interim CEO stints by Alan Horan. And so with each new CEO, you have a rotating cast in the C-suite as, the leader looks to put their stamp on the company. And so was Rogers really taking the kind of longer term view? And then, of course, you have huge downsides. As you pointed out, sometimes the majority of the economic stake in the company is owned by these shareholders who essentially have no vote. And if you look at what happened here at Rogers Communications, I think this was kind of a worst case scenario for, proponents of dual class share structures to see this kind of chaos playing out publicly, and you have all these shareholders who essentially don't get to have any say in whether or not Edward should reconstitute the board of Rogers Communications, and whether or not that board should then turn around and replace the CEO. And in fact, what was so interesting about Edward doing this through a written resolution was that it eliminated the need for a shareholder meeting. Now, you might ask, in a dual class share structure, why do you even need to have a shareholder meeting when effectively the person who's going to vote is Edward Rogers? But, evidence that was entered into court argued, from the other side, from the management side, that meeting is really essential so that the dual class shareholders, the class B shareholders who don't have a vote, are able to ask questions, and they're able to learn Edward's rationale. And then that gives them time to process that information and then to vote through buying and selling stock. So even though Edward, through the control trust, controls 97.5% of the vote, the argument was that the meeting is still significant. I don't know that I personally am able to take a for or against stance when it comes to dual class share structures. I certainly see pros and cons. When we have a case like this crop up, that definitely is a vote against. But at the same time, Rogers is actually a pretty compelling case study for dual class share structures if you look at how the company was built. And, if we were to, for instance, do away with them in Canada, they become a pretty common way for tech founders to take their companies public while still wanting to retain control. And if you were to ban them, for example, then, you might see those companies not listing in Canada. You might see them going and listing on another stock exchange that allows dual class share structures, or you might see them simply choosing to stay private and get investments from private equity. And then you actually have, potential shareholders missing out on the appreciation of value, the ability to grow their assets by investing in some of these exciting companies. And so that's certainly a drawback. Perhaps there's some sort of a middle ground. Some people have suggested things like a sunset provision, where those shares actually get sunsetted after a period of time. And that might be one way to try to get the best of both worlds.
That's a great answer, Alex. Like, there is no right. It depends. You know what I mean? Like, it really, if they didn't have it in place, would Rogers be where they are today? No. As you've pointed out, that is a great answer. And the book really outlines the pros and the cons of, and this is going to lead to the best quote in the book. This to me is my favorite quote in the entire book. And I'm going to try and tee it up a little bit here, because tragically, Ted's dad died really young. I think he was 35 or 36 years old or something like that, of a heart failure or whatever it is. And I think Ted was concerned about his own mortality throughout his life. And certainly the way he ran his business was not in a stress-free manner. It was, everything were like, it was like a high wire act. And so if he figured that, he would die at some point before, the average person would pass away, he's obviously concerned about succession and how that is going to pass on to the next generation. And the best quote, at least my perspective in this entire book, which is so, it reflects your answer so well, in that when they asked Ted about succession, his quote was, "I can't run the company from the grave, but I can certainly try." Like, what a great quote, because you can try and figure out all the potential avenues of how things are going to play, but you can't predict everything. So maybe just, now you've already done this a little bit, but maybe just touch on the what is unique with Rogers is obviously Ted passes away on December 2nd of 2008. I think he was in his mid 70s. Rogers at this time was worth, I think their market cap is about $18 billion, and they employed about 29,000 people is what I was picked up at this point. And maybe at this point, talk about, like, how did that event impact Rogers? Because Rogers, at least at that point, they had been preparing for this eventuality. They have two aspects of succession being they have to deal with CEO succession, and then they also have controlling shareholder succession, because Ted was basically both of those people. How did that, how did that event play at Rogers? Because to me, that was probably the most, that's kind of the start of all of this. You know what I mean? Even though it was years before things really started to play out. But that was the start, is when Ted unfortunately passed away in December of 2008.
I think it was really hard, not just for his family, but for the company's employees. Ted's health had been failing for a long time. He'd had numerous surgeries that had essentially allowed him to cheat death a number of times. He had a defibrillator implanted into his chest that revived him when he passed out during a heated family dispute. And he ultimately dies of heart failure, congestive heart failure. So his health had been deteriorating. There was even a cable car that had been installed at the cottage to ferry him from the cottage to the beach. And I think for employees of Rogers to have their fearless leader sort of slowly deteriorating in this very hard to watch way, I think that was painful for the people in the company to observe. And I think it was also very disorienting for the company because, like I've said, Ted was this larger than life guy. He had his hands in everything. He was so deeply involved in every single decision. I think even the night before he died, or very close to his death, he was asking his son Edward, grilling him about some of the financial metrics within the company. And so Rogers found itself, following Ted's passing, in this position of having to redefine itself without Ted. And I think that's very challenging for a company to do when you have such an involved founder, CEO, controlling shareholder, etc. Because under Ted, everybody knew what the company was, and now Ted is gone. And so what is Rogers going to be now? And this is one way in which Nadir Mohammed was a great choice for CEO following Ted's passing, because he was sort of the steady hand, right? He sort of steadied the ship, righted the ship after Ted's death, gave people an opportunity to sort of grieve, but also he had worked with Ted for years, right? He was a known entity, and he could continue along on all of the sort of plans that the company had in place. Now, of course, Nadir was sort of the steady hand, and Ted was like the big chaotic, big ideas guy. And so after a while, I think the company started to miss that kind of Ted Rogers energy. And this is where we end up seeing Guy Lawrence come in. He's the CEO who follows Nadir because he's this brash, boisterous, charismatic Brit, and he wants to shake things up. And he came up with this whole plan, Rogers 3.0, about how the company had lost its way following Ted's death. And that ultimately ends up going not exactly as he had promised. I mean, there were signs of, things turning around, and some of the things he was doing were starting to bear fruit, but maybe not as quickly as some people would have liked. And then, of course, Joe Natale becomes available because he gets let go from TELUS. And that ends up spurring essentially an early exit for Guy Lawrence. And so you see, the company kind of shift this way and then shift that way. And then we're supposed to find kind of a middle ground with Joe. But the family ultimately ends up not aligned on Joe, right, around the time of the Shaw deal, because Edward wants to replace Joe. Melinda thinks Joe is doing a great job. And Loretta and Martha, although they initially go along with Edward's plan, they ultimately end up deciding they no longer agree with Edward's plan, and they end up going along with the independent directors and with Melinda, who actually want to try to retain Joe Natale. And what's fascinating is that this fight between members of warring factions of the family and the board ends up becoming a lot about trying to interpret the wishes of a dead man, right? We see these documents filed in court, these family documents that had never been publicly released before. We see Ted's will, the control trust will, and we see his memorandum of wishes. And of course, like you say, Ted famously said, you can't rule from the grave, but you can try. And so this memorandum of wishes is his way of trying to do that, to cement his grip over the company even after he's gone, to cement his family's grip over the company after he's gone. And both sides in their various affidavits are quoting from this document to support their arguments as if it were the Bible. This document becomes this thing, and both sides can find ammo for their perspective in this document. Like, oh, well, Ted said the whole family should be consulted. Oh, but Ted wanted one person to be in charge, and I, Edward, am that person. And it's just fascinating because, of course, nobody can actually ask Ted what it is that he would want. But I think we can all agree that a very public dispute within his family is the last thing that he would want. In fact, he actually writes himself that, an embarrassing public spectacle would be the absolute worst case scenario. And so,
which fractures the family, and I'm sure that's the last thing he would want as well. And we're gonna get to that in a second, but yeah.
And it's sad, it's sad. It's dramatic, and it's fascinating, and it's unusual to see this kind of public dispute within such a prominent, affluent, and powerful family. But it's also sad, right? Because we all have conflicts within our families, and to see the way that these family members are, tearing each other apart in public, you do feel a level of empathy as a human being for what they're going through.
So let's turn on that then, because the way that your book starts, you basically hook the reader in, Alex, on the first couple of pages of your book. You only have to read the first couple of pages of the book in order to want to read the entire book, because you focus the starting of the book is on Loretta's last days is kind of when it starts. So maybe, and you talked about sadness. Obviously, the sad part of that is that Edward is not there. That's really sad that he's not there with his mom. And everything you read about later, again, this was a family that was close. You know what I mean? I think they talk earlier. You talking about the book about them going up and Loretta driving up those hills on the way to Muskoka, right? You can just picture that in your mind of her driving that car, up the hill and then down like a roller coaster, and the whole family, getting a chuckle out of that, right? Like that's how, what a nice story to tell in your book. But again, the way you start it's really sad, actually, and in the way it starts. So maybe just give some perspective on why on that start to the book. And again, once people read that first couple of pages, you're stuck. You're going to read the rest of the book because you've got to figure out how to eventually get to this point.
I thought that was a really crucial moment to illustrate just how deep the rift had become, because we do, of course, open with Loretta's deathbed, and various friends and family members have all gathered. Lisa's flown from Victoria across the country. Melinda and Martha are there. Loretta's closest friends are there. There's a man named Bob Reeves who works for the family holding company. We've got, 2 doctors and, other friends and relatives, and they've all gathered to say goodbye to Loretta, who, of course, is dying of cancer, which is also very sad. And the one person who isn't there is Edward. And, of course, heard conflicting things regarding the reason for his absence. But that's just, to me, such a powerful moment, because we see how this fight in this family was so severe that even Loretta's imminent death can't reconcile them. It can't get them all in the same room to say goodbye to their mother. And what's also unfortunate but interesting is that in the time after this fight broke out, we also actually saw the deaths of both Alan Horn and Phil Lind. And these were Ted's, top lieutenants within the company. And so what we're left with is actually just the kids, right? Mom is gone, dad is gone, dad's closest friends are gone. And so now we have this next generation of Roger's children having to navigate this situation where, like it or not, they all own this company together. And it's undeniable that they all want what's best for the company, because not only is all of their, not all, but, a significant portion of their wealth tied up in it, but also this is their family legacy. This is dad's legacy. It's such a defining thing for this family. So of course they all want what's best for it. They just all or some of them have, conflicting views on what that thing is. What is it that is best for Rogers? And I guess this would be a good time to mention that since the book was completed, we actually have seen a bit of a development there, which is a settlement. There's been a settlement in the family, and the terms of that settlement are confidential. But as part of that settlement, both Melinda and Martha have actually exited the Rogers board. So they are no longer directors of Rogers Communications.
And it just occurred to me now, as you're talking, as we compare it back to the TV series Succession, one of the things that always struck me watching that TV series is that no matter how bad things got between, whether it's the family members, the siblings or the parents, they would always come back and have a conversation, and at least, try and work things out. But the way that your book starts is Edward wasn't there. You know what I mean? They couldn't resolve it. He'll never get that time back. It is very it's quite a sad start. But like I said, once you read those first few pages, you're stuck, Alex. You have to read the rest of the book, and that's why I tell everybody, read the book. Last question I'll ask is there anything that's going to go beyond the book in terms of, like a series or a follow-up or anything like that? Can we expect any further things coming down the pipe? And if not on this, what's next? Is there another story that's coming out from Alex that we should be keen to watch out for?
So I would love for there to be some kind of dramatization of Rogers for the screen. Nothing that I am able to share at the moment about that, but I think that would be really cool. The one thing I will say we didn't get a chance to talk about that I would love to talk about is
Sure.
Brian Cox. When it comes to the Succession comparisons,
Yep.
The one thing that really jumps out that we haven't touched on is Brian Cox, the actor who plays Logan Roy, actually recording a Cameo video for Edward Rogers. So for anyone who doesn't know, Cameo, of course, is a website where you can buy personalized readings from various celebrities. And Brian Cox, who plays Logan Roy on Succession, is on the site. So you can get him to record you a personalized reading. And after Joe Natale was ultimately let go from Rogers Communications the following holiday season, Logan Roy sits down in a chair and he records a personalized greeting for Edward Rogers, congratulating him on his real life succession at Rogers Communications. And so for me, this was this, very bizarre moment where the two storylines, the fictional storyline that I was keenly watching on TV and the real life storyline that I was actively covering for the Globe and Mail and later for this book, actually started to blend together. So that was a very, very strange moment. And so I think any discussion of Rogers as a succession story needs a little bit of that context.
Well, here's a question for you, Alex. Do you think that Brian Cox knew where that message was going? In that, do you think this was just, one of 1,000 requests that he gets, and he's just like, reading from a piece of paper and then next, you know what I mean? Or do you think he actually knew, oh, this is like a real life succession that's playing out in Canada, probably something he is not that familiar with, and that this is actually going to, if this gets out, this is going to hit the front page of the Globe and Mail, that people are flying, sending this around. I just wonder, that's what I was thinking when I saw it, is that, did he actually know where this was going to end up? And I'm just wondering too, did you ever try and reach out to Brian Cox and say, like, Brian, like, did you know where this actually ended up? Like on the front page of the newspaper up here in little known Canada?
I've actually mailed him a copy of the book via one of his agents. But that is a great question that I would love for Brian Cox to weigh in on, because I have no idea. I've gotten no feedback from Mr. Cox, but I wondered that too. Because I'm sure he gets tons of requests for these things. And I'm sure that there's other succession style battles that play out in companies, all over the world. And
Absolutely.
So did he realize how big of a story this had become, and that video, or rather a reference to that video, would actually end up being referenced in a wrongful dismissal suit filed by Joe Natale for allegedly disparaging his reputation? That's a question that I have.
Well, look, to be clear to everybody listening, we have not covered so many of the great stories in the book, like the butt dial. I think if you want to learn about this butt dial, you have to read the book to understand. It is so integral to the book itself and the disputes and everything like that, and how that actually played out. Is the only thing you can do is read the book. And like I said, if you're sitting there even in a bookstore, if you even have bookstores anymore, again, Alex, I grew up in a time where I used to go to Kohl's and buy a book, but you only have to read. I was telling everybody, you only have to read the first 5 or 6 pages of this book before you realize you want to read the whole thing, because you're going to read the first 5 or 6 pages, and the way it starts, again, you're going to tear through the 300 pages in no time. It is a fascinating read. You're gonna learn so much. And again, it's a real story. This is not a fictional event. This is a real story. And again, what better compliment can you get from the people who are reading the book, who are actually there saying it's factual? I can't imagine a better compliment than that. That's exactly what a reader would want. Is that we don't want it sensationalized like it is in the TV series. It's a fictional event. We would want a factual replay of this event. What more could you want? And it's a terrific book. I would encourage everybody. Rogers v. Rogers. If you follow the instructions at the outset of this podcast, the book is going to be on the way. It's going to be on the way from Amazon, or it's going to be already in your Kindle or whatever, ready to go. And like I said, just read the first few pages, and you're going to be hooked for the rest of your day. But Alex, thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate your time here on CSI. Thank you very much, and we look forward to the next book, or the next podcast, or the next project, whatever it may be. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Scott. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Thanks.